It is so good to see you. I want to thank you for being here. I want to welcome those who are watching online. If you have your phone or your Bible with you, I want you to turn to Daniel chapter 10. Daniel chapter 10. Now, I don't know if you've been paying attention to this or not. I know a lot of you have, but some of you don't even know this is going on. But today marks the beginning of the second week of this year's Summer Olympics. Now, I'll be honest, I haven't watched hardly any of this. The only part I watched 5 minutes of badminton one night and 10 minutes of ping pong, which was awesome. But I'll be honest, like as I was watching the badminton, I was watching this, Cannon and I were watching, I thought, I could do that. You know what I'm saying? Like it didn't look like they were doing anything. And then I realized they were just warming up. Like the game had started, and when the game started, I quickly realized that's different than like what we used to do out in the yard, cookouts and all that kind of thing. So even though I haven't watched much of it, I did read the heartbreaking story of an Olympic athlete who grew up not far from here. His name is Brody Malone, and he's from Johnson City, Tennessee. I've got a picture of him. First time I saw this picture, I thought it was Jamie Reagan. Just kind of a sideways glance, I'll pay for that. What was I talking about? Yeah, Brody Malone. So he's the three-time national champion in men's gymnastics, and he's the only returning member this year from the 2021 Olympic team. So going into this year's games, he was one of the favorites to win a medal. That is until the wheels came off. And if you were watching any of this, some of you did, during his qualifying round, he made 4 dramatic mistakes, which is something he had never done before. First, he fell off the pommel horse. You know what I'm talking about, the thing they sort of spin around. He fell off of that. His second time through, he was performing what's considered a routine move that's normally his best event, and his hands slipped off the high bar, and he fell to the mat. I've got another picture that shows him lying on the mat after he fell. And then the third time through, they did the exact same thing, and of course that ended his opportunity to go to the next round. And so all of a sudden, one of the favorites was eliminated in the first round. The next day, Sports Illustrated picked up the story, and they sort of told the backstory, and they explained how just the fact that he made it that far was a miracle in and of itself. 18 months earlier, in March of 2023, he was in an event in Germany competing when he had a nasty fall, and he had what doctors then called a catastrophic knee injury. Tore all the ligaments in his right knee, broke 2 bones, wound up having to have 3 surgeries just to repair all the damage. And when it was over, according to the article, it wasn't just a matter of getting back in shape for the Olympics. It was that he had to learn to walk again. And so for 18 months, every day, he worked with physical therapists and personal trainers, not just to learn to walk and not just to achieve his mobility, but to get himself in the best condition possible so that he could achieve his dream of winning an Olympic medal. And then when the moment came, his hands hit that bar and his fingers slid off and it all came crashing down. USA Today interviewed him after that round. Here's what he said. He said, "You never really know how bad you want something until you get it taken away from you." You ever felt like that? Or maybe like him. You ever felt like your dreams were in your grasp, and then slowly your fingers slid off, and it all came crashing down? If you have, then I think you can relate to what we're getting ready to look at in Daniel chapter 10. So if you're just joining us for the last several weeks, we've been working our way through the Old Testament book of Daniel. And one of the things that's so complicated is after you transition from chapter 6 into chapter 7, the focus shifts in the story. And it's not so much focused on what Daniel and his friends did as it is what God is going to do in the future. So it moves from sort of history into prophecy. And as you continue through the book, the prophecies just get longer and more complicated and more detailed. In fact, the very last prophecy in the book starts in Daniel 10 and continues all the way through the end of Daniel 12. But because it's mostly a repeat of stuff we looked at earlier and a more elaborate version of some of the things we've already looked at, we're not going to spend hardly any time on chapter 11. But there is something cool in chapter 10 that I think will be helpful. And if you ever looked around and you wondered, why is everything so messed up? Daniel 10 answers that question, or at least hints at the answer to that question. So as Daniel chapter 10 opens, Daniel is now in his 90s, and he's lived in Babylon for more than 70 years. Remember the story? He was kidnapped as a young man, maybe 16, 17 years old. He was relocated to Babylon against his will. There he was put through the Babylonian school, and he became a servant or like a bureaucrat in this Babylonian empire. But the way the story goes, the entire time that he's been living in Babylon, while his mind and his body have been there, his heart has been 900 miles away in Jerusalem. And so the entire time he's been in Babylon, it's never quite felt like home. His thoughts and his emotions and his love have all been directed towards Jerusalem. And if you were here last weekend, we talked about how reading through the prophet Jeremiah, Daniel discovered that the Babylonian exile, what he was experiencing, was only going to last for 70 years. And so by the time you get to Daniel chapter 10, those 70 years have now come to an end. And so the time for God's people to go back home to God's city and rebuild God's house, rebuild the temple, has finally arrived. For Daniel, this has been the dream of his life. I mean, this is the thing he's prayed for. This is the thing he's worked toward. This is the thing he's tried to prepare himself and the people around him for. But then when the moment actually arrived, there were two things that happened that complicated the whole issue and made it clear to him that his dream, at least during his lifetime, was not going to happen. The first thing that happened is that when the time came, there was this Persian king named Cyrus, and he took this guy named Zerubbabel, and he appointed him as the governor of Judah. And so he told Zerubbabel, you can take all the Jewish people that want to go, and you can take them home, and you can begin the process of rebuilding the city. The problem was, when the day to sign up came, only 42,000 people wanted to go back home. Now that may sound like a lot, but when you realize they've been in exile for 7 decades, that's not even a drop in the bucket. And so here's Daniel, and his assumption was, hey, like the second we can go back home, everybody's going to sign up, everybody's going to be ready to go. But what he discovered is that a lot of those people had grown so comfortable in Babylon that they didn't want to go back to Jerusalem. The second thing that complicated it, though, is that of the 42,000 people that went back, they experienced very little success. Historians tell us that Zerubbabel and the 42,000 arrived in Jerusalem sometime in the summer of the year 536 BC. By that fall, they had cleared the area where the temple had been destroyed, and they'd resumed the daily sacrifices. By the next spring, they had laid sort of the foundation stones to rebuild the temple, and it looked as if they were well on their way to achieving their dream. But then for some unknown reason, all the work stopped, and nobody did anything for the next 15 years. And so here's Daniel back in Babylon. His heart is broken. This thing that he's dreamed about, that he's craved throughout his life, he's poured his heart into, it now looks as if it's not going to happen. It's then that chapter 10 opens, and Daniel is in a bad way. Verse 1 of chapter 10. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a revelation was given to Daniel, who was called Belteshazzar. Its message was true, and it concerned a great war. The understanding of the message came to him in a vision. At that time, I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks. I ate no choice food, no meat or wine touched my lips, and I used no lotions at all until the 3 weeks were over. So here's this picture. Here's Daniel. He is so distraught at what's happened, or rather what hasn't happened that he thought was going to happen, that he's not eating anything, he's not drinking anything, he's not even like taking care of his personal hygiene. I mean, he has kind of shut this thing down, and he has sort of closed himself off, And it's almost like a picture of somebody that's depressed. He doesn't feel like doing anything. He doesn't feel like going anywhere. He has no idea how this is all going to turn out, but it's not like he expected. But then you get to verse 4, and there's this messenger that shows up that tells him something that changes everything. Verse 4. On the 24th day of the first month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river of the Tigris, I looked up, and there before me was a man dressed in linen, with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like topaz, his face was like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and his voice like the sound of a multitude. Now, here's what I wanted to get. Here's sort of the big idea that we're going to talk about today. It's this. It's that what you see is not all there is. Let me say it again. What you see happening around you, what you think is happening in other places, what happens to you, like the part of all of this that you see is not all there is. And here's why it's important. I don't know why we do this, but as human beings, we have this incredible ability to take one little thing that we see and somehow construct a larger story that we think explains what we're seeing. Psychologists call that our personal narrative. So you see just one little thing happens, and we've all done this, right? So I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but some of us like to raise both hands, right? Like we see one little thing, one conversation, we see bits and pieces of one event, and in our minds, we immediately start writing a story that we think explains what we're seeing. And most of the time, the story that we're writing is always negative, right? It couldn't just be something random. It couldn't be a coincidence. It has to be something negative. But the problem with that is, because what we see is so limited, the conclusions we reach are often inaccurate. I love the way Pastor John Piper said this when he wrote, God is always doing 10,000 things in your life, and you may be aware of 3 of them. And the reason I love that is because it's true. But it's not just true for you, like it's true for everybody. God may be doing 10,000 things in the people around you's lives too, and you don't know any of those things because we see just bits and pieces. We don't really know what's really happening. 1 Corinthians 13, the Apostle Paul explained it like this. He said, for we know in part, and we prophesy in part, meaning what we see is limited. What we see in front of us is not all there is. But when the completeness comes, what is in part disappears. So here's one way to think about it. Right now, honestly, we don't really know enough about what's going on around us to even know what we don't know. Like we don't even know the questions to ask. But Paul says one day, when the completeness comes, we'll start to see how all of these random pieces fit together to form this plan that God has been doing that we weren't even aware of. And that's where Daniel found himself. He didn't know what he didn't know. Like in his mind, all of this is falling apart. He sees this little bit, and he comes to the conclusion that everything is falling apart, everything has come up empty. But from God's perspective, rather than falling apart, all of these pieces are coming together because God is doing something that Daniel doesn't know anything about. And that's how God works. That's why in verse 4, God shows up and he gives Daniel this like the briefest glimpse behind the curtain. He says, there's like this curtain, and on one side of the curtain is everything you see, but on the other side of the curtain, there's a whole lot more going on that you don't see, and even if you could see it, like you're not even capable of understanding it. And so he opens just that curtain just enough to give Daniel this glimpse behind it. And because he doesn't answer every question and because he doesn't explain every scenario, we have to be careful with some of the conclusions we draw. But that being said, there are some things that God allows Daniel to see in this chapter that can help us as we try to navigate life in our world. See, Daniel was a lot like some of us in that he had no idea what to think about what was happening. And he had no idea about how he was supposed to feel in regards to what was happening to him. So in verse 7, he basically melts down and he passes out, which is what you would do. Verse 7, I, Daniel, was the only one who saw the vision. Those who were with me did not see it. But such terror overwhelmed me that they fled and hid themselves, so I was left alone, gazing at this great vision. I had no strength left. My face turned deathly pale, and I was helpless. Then I heard him speaking, and as I listened to him, I fell into a deep sleep, my face to the ground. Verse 10, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. He said, Daniel, you who are highly esteemed, consider carefully the words I'm about to speak to you and stand up, for I have now been sent to you. And when he said this to me, I stood up trembling. So he says, Daniel, I'm going to show you some stuff. And you're not going to understand it. And you're not going to be able to draw every logical conclusion for it. I'm going to show you. But what I'm going to show you is that what you see is not all there is. And so the first thing he shows him is that there is this intense battle going on between good and evil. Check out verse 12. Then he continued, do not be afraid, Daniel, since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them. But the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me because I was detained there with the king of Persia. Now I have come to explain to you what will happen to your people in the future, for the vision concerns a time yet to come. Now this is kind of a behind-the-scenes look at how prayer works. If you ever prayed for something and you thought, it doesn't feel like anything's happening, this may be the explanation. Daniel has been praying for 3 weeks for some kind of answer. He's been in mourning, he's been depressed, he's been grieving what's happened, and he's been asking God to show him something and that will give him hope. And so it says that God sent an angel to give him this answer, but then verse 13 it mentions this mysterious figure called the prince of the Persian kingdom who somehow obstructed the angel's path and delayed the answer. And so the implication as you read this, and again, you have to hold your conclusions lightly, but the implication is that this prince of Persia is some kind of fallen angel, some kind of satanic agent who works behind the scenes to try and disrupt what God is trying to accomplish. Now, if that sounds weird to you, it does sound weird. Like, you're right. But the reason it sounds so strange to some of us is because this is a part of the Bible that we're just almost completely unfamiliar with. And so we read something like this and we don't know what to make of it. But again, the main point that we're driving home here is that what you see is not all there is. Abraham Kuyper, who was a brilliant theologian who later became the prime minister of the Netherlands, said it this way. He said, if once the curtain were pulled back and the spiritual world behind it came into view, it would expose to our spiritual vision a struggle so intense, so convulsive, sweeping everything within its range, that the fiercest battle ever fought on earth would seem by comparison a mere game. Not here, I mean, it's not something you see, but up there. That's where the real conflict is waged. Our earthly struggle drones in its backlash. In other words, there's this intense spiritual battle that's taking place, or what verse 1 of Daniel 10 calls this great war, and it's taking place behind the curtain, and we don't see it. Now, sometimes we see the effects of it, and sometimes we suffer the effects of it, but there's this battle that's taking place in places that we can't see, in ways that we can't fully understand. So the way I understand this, and again, my understanding is limited, but there are two types of spiritual beings, right? On one side, you have angels, which are these immortal beings who are working to accomplish God's will in different places throughout God's universe. On the other side, you have this group of fallen angels who fell with Satan at the time of his rebellion against God, and they're doing everything they can to disrupt what God is trying to accomplish in his own universe. And so they're constantly at war with one another. And now here's where it gets really complicated. And remember, because our information is limited, we don't fully understand this. But as you read Daniel 10, it seems to indicate that because Satan is not omnipresent like God is, meaning that Satan can only be in one place at one time, it seems as if he has somehow set up like this network of fallen angels who are in different places working to disrupt whatever God is trying to do. So in this instance, he mentions the Prince of Persia. In other places, there are different geographical locations that are tied to certain fallen angels. Now, I don't necessarily know what all that means, but when you take it all together, it makes sense that Satan is doing everything he can behind the curtain to disrupt what God is doing in front of the curtain in your life and in my life. Now, before you think, that sounds crazy, right? Keep in mind, it's almost the exact same thing the Apostle Paul said in Ephesians 6 when he wrote this. He said, finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. What's he saying? He's saying your battle is not against what you see. Your battle is not against other people that you think are standing in the way. And in the church world, sometimes we have a bad habit of this. It's always like us versus them, right? And them as anybody that's not like us. But Paul says, that's really not what this is about. He said, there is this battle that's going on behind the scenes, behind the curtain, and that's who you're fighting against. It's those evil forces that are caught up in the spiritual forces of evil, the authorities of this dark world. That's what you're working against. They're doing everything they can to disrupt God's plan, and you're to do everything you can where you are to accomplish God's plan. And so the question then is, how do you fight back against an enemy that you can't see? And that's the second thing you see in this passage. It's that in this spiritual battle, prayer is our primary weapon. In verse 12, you go back to that, this angel, who just to be clear, is a different person than the one described in verse 5, tells Daniel this entire exchange, this entire conversation is happening in response to his prayers. Verse 12 says, then he continued, do not be afraid, Daniel, since the first day you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God. Your words were heard, meaning your prayers were heard, and I came in response to them. So the clear implication is that this whole time, this messenger, this angel has been trying to get to Daniel. This prince of Persia, whoever, whatever that is, has stood in his way, has obstructed his path. But all of that is happening, Daniel continues to do like the only thing he can do, which is he just continues to pray. And it's as he continues to pray that God does stuff behind the curtain that Daniel can't see and can't understand to get him the answer that he's been looking for. So with that in mind, let me ask you a question. And this may sting a little bit because it stings me. What if God only did in your life what you specifically prayed and asked him to do? Think about that. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, said this. He said, God does nothing but an answer to believing prayer. And I'm not sure I'd go that far, but just for the sake of self-reflection, just ask yourself, what would my life look like if God only did for me what I prayed and specifically asked him to do? What about your family? You might think, what would my family look like if all God ever did for us is what we specifically prayed and asked him to do? Or if you consider this your church home, you might ask yourself, what would our church look like if all that ever happened here was in response to what I specifically prayed and asked God to do? Now, the reason that stings is because you look back over your life and probably over your family's life, you realize God has done a lot more for you than you ever asked him to do. And I'm thankful he does. But I also know, as hard as this is to understand, there are things that happen when you pray and ask God to do something that otherwise aren't going to happen. There's something about the prayers of God's people that gets God's attention and causes him to act in a way that he might not otherwise act. James 5:16 says it like this, the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. And the experience of Daniel demonstrates that. Like he says, all of this is happening because you prayed and asked for God to do something. And so the same thing is true of us. If we want God to do something specific, or we want God to do more in us and among us, it starts with us praying and consistently praying and asking him to do more of that thing. And so even though when you pray, it might look like nothing is happening, you don't know what's happening behind the curtain that otherwise might not happen unless you continue to pray. One writer said this, he said, prayer is our partnership with God in transforming history. And you read through the book of Daniel, it demonstrates over and over again. That's true of kingdoms and world empires. It's true of big cities and small towns. It's even true of individuals. And so if you look at what's happening around you and what you can see happening in front of you, and you think to yourself, you know, we could use a little transformation, then you start the process by praying and asking God to do something that you may not initially see him doing. And even if you do, you may not understand exactly what he's doing. But it doesn't mean he's not doing it. One more thing that we learn from this story that I don't want you to miss. And that's because of Jesus, we know we're going to win even when it looks like we're losing. Because of Jesus, we know we have this promise that we're going to win even when everything in front of us and everything around us tells us that we're losing. So I told you earlier, I think there are two different people that Daniel interacts with in this encounter. In verse 10, the person speaking, I think, is an angel who's come to deliver a specific message. But if you go back to verse 5, Daniel describes this first person that he saw, and it's not an angel. Instead, Daniel refers to him as a man. If you have an NIV Bible that has a title heading, they don't label it Daniel's conversation with an angel. They label it Daniel's vision with a man. Verse 5 says, I looked up, and there before me was a man dressed in linen with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like topaz. His face was like lightning. His eyes were like flaming torches, and his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and his voice like the sound of the multitude. So, of course, the question is, who is that man? The same question that Nebuchadnezzar asked back in Daniel chapter 3 when he looked in that furnace and he saw the math didn't add up. He knew I put Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but he looked in, and all of a sudden he saw this fourth person, and he said, who is that fourth person? I think the same person Nebuchadnezzar saw is the same person that Daniel saw. And you get to Daniel 7, and Daniel he sees this vision, and it talks about this Son of Man who's going to be ultimately be given authority over all of God's creation, over all the earth and all of heaven. And he refers to him over and over again as a Son of Man. And I think that this mysterious person who keeps showing up at all these pivotal moments in the book of Daniel is the pre-incarnate second member of the Trinity, Jesus. And the reason I believe that, you go to Revelation chapter 1, you kind of fast forward. You know, Revelation is kind of a sister, a commentary on Daniel. And so he gets there, and the Apostle John now is given this vision of Jesus, and I want you to listen to how he describes him. He says, he was like a son of man, dressed in a robe, reaching down to his feet with a golden sash around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow. His eyes were like a blazing furnace. Feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. It's almost a word-for-word match to the person Daniel described. So make sure you catch this. Isn't it interesting that every single time throughout Daniel's story, every time it looks as if all hope is lost, every time it looks as if all his dreams are unraveling and crashing down around him, that Jesus unexpectedly shows up and does something for him that he could have never done for himself. And reminds him that what you see is not all there is. And what's happening around you and what's happening in front of you is not all that's happening. There is so much more happening behind the curtain that you can't see and don't understand. So one of the mistakes we make, we read this book of Daniel and we read it as if it's a story about what Daniel did. And so the takeaway is, hey, be more like Daniel. It's not it. It's not a story. It's not a story. It's not a book about what Daniel did. It's a book about what God is doing. And it's a story about what God is continuing to do, even when it feels like he's not doing anything. Let's look how the story ends, verse 15. Here's what happens. While he was saying this to me, I bowed with my face toward the ground and was speechless. The one who looked like a man touched my lips, and I opened my mouth and began to speak. I said to the one standing before me, I am overcome with anguish because of the vision, my Lord, and I feel very weak. How can I, your servant, talk with you, my Lord? My strength is gone, and I can hardly breathe. Make sure you don't miss verse 18. Verse 18. Again, the one who looked like a man touched me and gave me strength. Do not be afraid, you who are highly esteemed, he said. Peace, be strong now, be strong. When he spoke to me, I was strengthened and said, Speak, my Lord, that you have given me strength. Where did Daniel's strength come from? Wasn't him. And it wasn't what he saw happening in front of him. Because everything he saw happening in front of him was bad. Instead, his strength came from the one that came to rescue him. The same thing the Apostle Paul said in Ephesians 6. He said, Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. And after you've done everything, how do you stand? Not because you're so strong. It's because God has surrounded you. He sent somebody to rescue you. And because of him, we have this promise that we're going to win even when it looks like we're losing. So I got one last picture I want to show you. I told you earlier that after everything he had been through, the failure of Brody Malone to make it to the next round was a heartbreaking turn of events. One journalist who covered the events of that night said that when it was over, he went back to the locker room and he wrote a formal apology to his teammates. And that night, they all gathered in the locker room and he read the apology to them. He was so distraught at his failure. He then spent the entire night with a trusted coach and a trainer, and they went through frame by frame and dissected his performance, trying to figure out what went wrong. The rest of the story, though, is 48 hours later, he performed flawlessly in the team event. Now, he missed his individual medal, but he helped the United States achieve their first medal in gymnastics since 2008. The USA Today ran the headline, How Brody Malone Went from the Worst Meet of His Life to Powering the USA to Olympic Bronze. Now, for people who are into gymnastics, it's the kind of turnaround that will be talked about for years. 20 years from now, people will remember how this went down. But the more I thought about it, I realized, like, that's us. You know what I'm saying? Like, for most of us, our individual performance has not been very good. Like you look back and your execution's been bad. And some of us have spent years, some of us have spent decades like dissecting our performance and trying to figure out where it all went wrong. And we feel like you feel the weight of the world on your shoulders because you haven't accomplished what you thought you would accomplish, and you're not even who you thought you would be, right? You think, I should be past this, I should be better than this, and then something happens and you realize, boy, I'm still not very good. That's us, man. That's our story. That's all of us. But here's what I'll make sure you understand. Even though your individual performance may not be very good, if you're on the right team, you still get a medal. And here's the thing. Jesus wants you to be on his team. There's this phrase that gets used over and over again throughout the book of Daniel. Anytime an angel speaks to Daniel, he always refers to him as somebody who is highly esteemed. In Hebrew, it just means, it's a two-word phrase that just means a coveted man. And so in the best sense of the word, one of the things we know about Daniel is that he was a wanted man, right? God wanted him to be on the inside. He wanted him to be in the family. And the same thing is true of him. It is true of all of us. You are, in the best sense of the word, you are a wanted man. You are a wanted woman. You are coveted. God wants you to be on his team so that you can be a part of the winning team, even if your individual performance up till this point has not been very good. And just the truth is, your individual performance has not been very good. So if you want to win, you better make sure you're on the right team. And the great thing about Daniel is that we know that even when it looks like we're losing, we still can win as long as you're on the right team. I want you to stand with me. We're going to sing just a couple songs here. If you want to pray with somebody, we'll talk to somebody. Maybe you have questions about what this all looks like for you. David's over here. I'm going to be over here. We'd be glad to pray with you, be glad to talk with you, answer any questions you might have. If you're ready to make a public decision to join God's team, to join the team here at First Christian, we'd be honored to help you do that. Whatever you need to do, just meet me on this front.